A black pilot, freshly retired after 20 years of service, finally boards a flight home, ready to start a new chapter in his life. But the moment he steps into the airport, everything changes. A TSA agent eyes him with suspicion, his gaze lingering a little too long. Then, just as he's about to pass through security, the questions start. His ID is scrutinized, his bag double-checked, and within moments, he's being pulled aside for a random inspection. At first, he complies, used to the routine, but something is different this time. The agent's tone is sharp, his movements aggressive, his assumptions clear. Before the pilot can even process what's happening, he's being accused of traveling under false pretenses. A crowd begins to gather, whispers filling the air. Then, in just 6 minutes, everything escalates. The pilot, who has dedicated 2 decades to protecting this country, is now being treated like a criminal in his own home. But what happens next? No one saw it coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, don't forget to subscribe for more. This all started on what should have been an ordinary day. Elijah Carter walked into the first-class cabin with the quiet assurance of a man who had long grown accustomed to eyes that measured him before they greeted him. Standing at 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands that had gripped more victories than most men could count, he carried himself with a dignity that did not demand attention. It commanded it. The murmurs began before he even reached his seat. A few passengers exchanged glances, subtle but telling. An older man in a tailored suit shifted uncomfortably in his leather seat. A woman in pearls, her hair set in the careful order of old money, stole a glance at his neck, where a gold chain glimmered under the soft cabin lights. It bore the weight of a cross, a symbol that, in another context, would have drawn nods of approval. But on his chest, it was something else, something to be questioned. He settled into his seat with practiced ease, ignoring the undercurrent of quiet judgment. He had been here before, though the setting changed. First, it had been in school, where teachers doubted his intelligence before they noticed his talent. Then, on the court, where his skill was celebrated but his mind underestimated. Now, in the polished confines of a first-class cabin, the challenge remained, to exist where he was not expected. The flight attendant approached, her smile tight, her eyes never quite meeting his. It was the kind of expression he had seen many times, a forced politeness masking an unease that had no name but felt all the same. "Mr. Carter," she began, hesitating just long enough for him to know something was coming. "We want to ensure all passengers feel comfortable on this flight." He raised an eyebrow. "And am I making someone uncomfortable?" His voice was even, his words measured. She hesitated again, glancing at the gold cross against his chest as though it carried an offense she could not quite articulate. "Some passengers have expressed concerns about certain displays," she said, her voice lowering as though the words themselves might betray her. Elijah leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had learned long ago that anger was never the first tool to reach for. He had also learned that some fights did not announce themselves as battles but arrived wrapped in the soft language of propriety and policy. He looked at her then. Truly looked. And in her face, he saw not malice, but something more dangerous, the quiet assurance of a person who had never questioned the rules she enforced. And so, the game began. Elijah Carter did not answer right away. He had long since learned that silence could be more unsettling than any outburst. That measured quiet could unearth discomfort more effectively than rage. He tilted his head slightly, studying the flight attendant the way a seasoned player studies the court before making his move. "You'll have to help me understand," he said at last, his voice smooth but firm. "What is it about my necklace that makes anyone uncomfortable?" The flight attendant faltered, but only for a moment. She had expected compliance, not conversation. "It's just that," she began, her fingers tightening around the small notepad in her hands. "Some passengers might feel that certain symbols can be divisive." The word hung in the air, delicate and deadly. Divisive, a word that carried more than its fair share of weight in this country. A word that had justified countless acts of exclusion under the guise of neutrality. Elijah let out a slow breath. a soundless laugh almost slipping through his lips. He had heard it before. In different places. From different mouths. But always the same message. You are welcome. But only if you do not remind us that you are here. He leaned forward, resting his powerful forearms on his knees. Tell me something, he said, lowering his voice just enough to make her lean in. If I were wearing a crucifix carved from ivory, hanging from a delicate silver chain, would we be having this conversation? The flight attendant blinked, thrown off balance. She opened her mouth, closed it again. The answer was obvious, but she was not allowed to say it. That was the unspoken rule of this game. Nearby, a man in a navy blue blazer, one of those who had stolen glances when Elijah first boarded, cleared his throat. Now, listen, he said, adjusting his seatbelt as though preparing for turbulence. I'm sure she's just doing her job. Elijah turned toward him slowly, his expression unreadable. And what job is that? The man hesitated, glancing at the flight attendant as if looking for backup. She had none to give. The cabin was growing quiet now. Ears tuning in, heads shifting. The murmurs of polite indifference were beginning to dissolve into something heavier. Something that carried consequences. Elijah let the silence settle before speaking again. His voice steady but unyielding. You see, I know what this is. This is not about policy. This is not about rules. This is about power. About who gets to decide what is acceptable, what is appropriate, and most of all, what is visible. The flight attendant's fingers twitched against her notepad. She knew this had gone further than she had intended. It had started as a simple request. Or so she had thought. But that was the thing about power. It was only simple when you were the one holding it. Elijah sat back, a slow smile curving his lips. So, tell me, he said, gesturing at the cross on his chest. Do I take it off? Or do we all take a moment to think about why you asked me to? The question was heavier than any piece of gold. And in that moment, it was no longer just the flight attendant who felt its weight. The moment stretched, tense and unyielding, as though the very air in the first-class cabin had thickened. Elijah Carter remained still, his fingers resting lightly on the armrest. His gaze steady on the flight attendant who had not yet found a way to respond. This was the part of the game that always intrigued him. Not the demand itself, but the unraveling that followed. Because it was never really about the necklace. No, it was about something much older. Much deeper. Something buried beneath the surface of everyday life but never quite out of reach. The flight attendant swallowed hard. Her carefully rehearsed authority slipping. She had made a request. But now she was faced with the implications of that request. And she was beginning to understand that it was not as harmless as she had told herself. The man in the navy blue blazer, eager to return things to a more comfortable order, cleared his throat again. Look, it's just a misunderstanding, he said, his voice carrying that particular brand of patronizing reassurance that came from a lifetime of assuming his words held the final say. I'm sure no one meant any offense. Elijah turned to him slowly, his expression still unreadable. No offense? He let the words settle. Let them marinate in the space between them. That's an interesting choice of words. The man shifted in his seat. But before he could respond, a woman across the aisle, older, her hair a pristine silver, spoke up. Excuse me, she said, her voice measured but firm. Would you ask a nun to remove her cross? Would you ask a rabbi to take off his Star of David? The question cut through the cabin like a knife. The flight attendant flinched. Just slightly, but enough. Elijah said nothing. He didn't have to. The truth had a way of speaking for itself once it had been forced into the open. A younger man, maybe in his 30s, frowned and shifted in his seat. I don't see why this is such a big deal, he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. If they asked me to take something off, I wouldn't make a scene about it. Elijah's gaze landed on him then. Not with anger, but with the kind of patience that came from knowing exactly how this argument played out. That's because they wouldn't ask you, he said simply. The man opened his mouth, then closed it. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now, but no less firm. It's not about the necklace. It never was. It's about reminding me that I am here on borrowed time. That my presence in this space is conditional. He gestured subtly to the other passengers. And what's always fascinating, is how quickly people will rush to defend a rule that doesn't even exist. A hush fell over the cabin. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of unspoken truths, of quiet reckonings, of the weight of a history that had never really gone away. Elijah sat back again, exhaling slowly. So, he said, turning back to the flight attendant. Are we done here? The flight attendant hesitated, but the moment had already slipped beyond her control. She had been prepared to enforce an unspoken rule. She had not been prepared to explain it. She swallowed again, then nodded stiffly. Yes, sir, she murmured. But Elijah knew better. They were never really done. Elijah Carter watched the flight attendant retreat down the aisle, her stiff posture betraying the storm brewing beneath her crisp uniform. The hush in the cabin was fragile, stretched thin like an old rope fraying at the edges, threatening to snap at any moment. He had seen this before. The way a moment of reckoning left people scrambling, uncertain whether they should smooth things over or let the discomfort linger. The man in the navy blue blazer sighed, shaking his head. You didn't have to make it a whole thing, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those around him to hear. Elijah turned his head slightly, not enough to face him directly, but enough to let him know he had heard. Make it a whole thing, he repeated, his voice calm, deliberate. Tell me something, sir. When does it become a whole thing? Is it when I ask a question? When I refuse to back down? Or was it already a whole thing the moment she walked over and decided that what I wore was a problem? The man exhaled through his nose, shifting uncomfortably. I just mean, look, nobody wants to sit on a flight with tension hanging in the air. It's about keeping the peace. Elijah let out a soft, humorless chuckle. Ah, keeping the peace. He finally turned to the man, his eyes sharp, but not unkind. And whose peace are we talking about? Yours? Hers? Or mine? The man opened his mouth, but Elijah didn't give him the chance. See, that's the trick, isn't it? You can dress it up in polite words. Comfort, civility, keeping the peace, but it always comes down to the same thing. There is a line, and I am not supposed to cross it. Not because it's written anywhere, not because it's in any rulebook, but because it's understood, because it's always been understood. The woman with silver hair, the one who had spoken earlier, nodded slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had lived long enough to recognize the rhythm of this moment. The push and pull between expectation and resistance, between what was tolerated and what was not. The younger man from before, the one who had claimed it wasn't a big deal, let out a huff and crossed his arms. Why does everything have to be about race? Elijah turned his gaze to him now, his expression unreadable. Everything, he echoed. I'm sitting on a flight, minding my business. Someone walks up to me and tells me that my necklace, a cross, no less, makes people uncomfortable. And you want to ask why it's about race? He leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the space between them. It was already about race. The moment she singled me out. The moment people started justifying it. The moment you decided that my response was the problem, and not the fact that it happened at all. A shift moved through the cabin now. Small but undeniable. The weight of truth had a way of doing that. Tilting the ground ever so slightly. Making people recalibrate their footing. Elijah let the silence stretch for a moment longer before leaning back. But I'll tell you what, he said, his voice softer now. If you really want to know why this is about race, ask yourself this. If I looked different, would this have happened at all? No one answered, because everyone already knew. The air in the first-class cabin had changed. It was thick now, charged with the kind of tension that made people shift in their seats, glance at one another without speaking, clear their throats just to fill the silence. The veneer of civility had cracked, and beneath it lay something raw, something unspoken but understood. Elijah Carter had seen it too many times before. In boardrooms, in locker rooms, in places where power moved quietly, where rules weren't written down but were enforced all the same. He had seen it in the way security guards lingered near him in department stores. In the way polite smiles turned stiff when he walked into a room where he wasn't expected. And now, here it was again, at 30,000 feet. wrapped in the language of decorum and comfort. The flight attendant had disappeared. But the damage had been done. The passengers had chosen their sides. Not in open declarations, but in body language, in the way some looked at him now with new understanding, while others looked away, resentful that the moment had stretched beyond its comfort. The man in the navy blue blazer, still clinging to his sense of rightness, exhaled sharply. I just don't understand why everything has to be a fight with you people. Elijah turned to him, his expression unreadable. You people, he repeated, slowly, letting the words settle between them. A younger woman in the next row gasped softly. The man stiffened, realizing too late that he had said more than he meant to. His face darkened with frustration. But whether it was with Elijah or with himself, it was hard to say. Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice calm but firm. Tell me something, he said. If you walked onto this flight, sat down, and someone told you to remove something that meant something to you, what would you do? The man scoffed, shaking his head. That's different. How? It just is. Elijah nodded, as if that was the answer he had been expecting. That's the thing, isn't it? He said. It's always different when it happens to someone else. He let the words linger. Let them soak into the silence. Across the aisle, the older woman with the silver hair, the one who had spoken up before, crossed her arms. He's right, she said. It's different because you don't have to think about it. That's what privilege is. The man turned toward her, his mouth opening in protest. But she cut him off with a look. I've been alive long enough to see this happen over and over again. The problem isn't that he's making it a fight. The problem is that you don't think he should be allowed to. The man in the blazer looked away, his jaw tightening. Elijah exhaled, but there was no victory in it. This wasn't about winning or losing. It never was. It was about something deeper. Something that had been passed down through generations like an inheritance no one had asked for. The plane hummed beneath them, steady and indifferent. Outside the window, the sky stretched endless and open, unburdened by the weight of history. Inside the cabin, the weight remained. The plane moved forward through the sky, smooth and relentless. But inside the cabin, the air was jagged with something unspoken. A choice had been made, whether consciously or not, by everyone on board. Some had leaned forward, engaged, watching as Elijah Carter carved his space, refusing to shrink. Others had folded their arms, shifted in their seats, longing for the moment to pass so they could return to a world where such things were swept under the rug. Elijah remained still, though he knew what was coming next. It always came, in one form or another. The flight attendant returned, but this time she was not alone. A man followed behind her, tall and neat in appearance, his uniform crisp, his eyes sharp with authority. The supervisor, Mr. Carter, the man said, his voice low, controlled. I understand there's been a misunderstanding. Elijah studied him. A misunderstanding, he echoed. Yes. The man continued, his tone practiced, as though he had handled situations like this before, as though he believed all problems could be resolved with a carefully measured dose of professionalism. Our goal is to maintain a comfortable environment for all passengers. We don't want any unnecessary disturbances. Unnecessary disturbances. Elijah let the phrase settle in the space between them. Heavy with meaning. He had heard variations of it his whole life. The language of those who did not want trouble but were more than willing to cause it in the name of order. He leaned back in his seat, tilting his head slightly. So tell me, he said, voice steady, what exactly do you consider unnecessary? The supervisor hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. The older woman across the aisle narrowed her eyes. Are you asking him to be quiet? She asked. Her voice clear, cutting. The supervisor turned toward her, taken off guard. No, ma'am, not at all. We simply want to ensure that all passengers feel comfortable. Elijah let out a low chuckle. Comfort, he mused. Funny thing about comfort. Seems to me it only matters when it's someone else's. The supervisor stiffened. Mr. Carter, I assure you, we treat all our passengers equally. Quote. Elijah cut him off, his voice still calm but edged now with something sharper. Something undeniable. No, you don't. A few passengers gasped softly. as if he had broken an unspoken rule by saying it outright. Elijah sat forward now, his hands resting on his knees. His presence undeniable. If you did, you wouldn't be standing here right now. You wouldn't be asking me to be reasonable about something that was never reasonable to begin with. You wouldn't be explaining away what we all know is true. He gestured toward the flight attendant. She asked me to remove my necklace because someone, somewhere, decided it made them uncomfortable. And instead of telling them that their discomfort was their own to manage. You came here to manage me. The silence was different now. He had named it, had stripped the polite words down to their bones. And now there was nowhere left for them to hide. The supervisor shifted, his fingers tightening at his sides. He glanced toward the other passengers, suddenly aware that all eyes were on him. The weight of the moment pressed down, demanding something real. Finally, he exhaled, slow and deliberate. "Mr. Carter," he said, voice quieter now, "you have every right to wear your necklace." Elijah nodded once. "I know." The supervisor hesitated again, then gave a small, reluctant nod before turning and walking away. The flight attendant following closely behind. Elijah leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment, letting the tension settle around him. It was never about the necklace. It never was. The supervisor had walked away. But the moment had not passed. It lingered, thick in the cabin air, refusing to dissipate like the distant rumble of a storm that had yet to break. Elijah Carter had seen it before. The way power recoiled when challenged. How those who wielded it instinctively looked for a way to reclaim their footing. It was never enough to simply let a moment like this pass. There was always a consequence for those who refused to yield. The flight attendant did not return. Instead, a murmur passed through the rows of first-class passengers. The kind of hushed conversation that carried meaning even in its silence. A man in a dark suit whispered to his companion, their eyes flicking toward Elijah, as if measuring him, calculating his defiance. A woman near the aisle sighed, shaking her head, the expression on her face not one of sympathy but of weary disapproval. It was the kind of look that said, "Why couldn't you just let it go?" A flight this long had plenty of time for tension to brew, for resentment to form, and now Elijah could feel it. Less overt than the confrontation with the flight attendant, but more insidious. The young man from earlier, the one who had asked why everything had to be about race, had his phone out now, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. It was impossible to tell if he was texting, tweeting, or recording, but Elijah knew this too was part of it. The quiet punishment, the shifting of the narrative. He had played this game before. And then, as if on cue, a new voice entered the scene. "Excuse me, sir." Elijah turned, and there, standing in the aisle, was a different flight attendant. This one male, his face unreadable, his stance stiff. He did not fidget, did not hesitate like the first. This one had come with a decision already made. "I've been asked to inform you that the captain would like to have a word with you after we land," the attendant said, his voice clipped. Professional. Elijah didn't react right away. He simply let the words settle. Let them find their place in the already heavy air. He could feel the eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. He nodded, slowly. "And why is that?" The attendant's expression didn't change. It's standard protocol when a passenger is involved in a situation that may have disrupted the flight experience for others. A few passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to hear, others leaning in just slightly, eager for the spectacle. Elijah exhaled softly through his nose. There it is, he thought, the punishment for refusing to bow, wrapped up in professional courtesy, delivered with a smile that barely concealed the warning underneath. He glanced around the cabin, his gaze landing on the silver-haired woman across the aisle, the one who had defended him earlier. She met his eyes, understanding without words what had just happened. And then, the man in the navy blue blazer, the one who had dismissed him before, sighed and shook his head again. "See," he muttered, "this is what happens when you don't just let things be." Elijah turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "No," he said, voice even, steady, "this is what happens when people don't want to admit what they've done." The flight attendant didn't move, waiting for Elijah's response. There was no need to argue. The decision had already been made. Elijah Carter had spent his entire life knowing that resistance had a price. And today, at 30,000 feet, they were making sure he paid it. The descent had begun, but the tension in the first-class cabin did not ease with the altitude. If anything, it thickened, pressing against the walls like something alive, something unresolved. Elijah Carter sat still, his body unmoving, but his mind was already at the gate, already standing in front of the captain, already hearing the words that would come next. They would not be shouted at. They would not be vulgar. That was never how this was done. No, it would be civil, measured. They would explain that this was standard protocol, that they just needed to document everything for safety reasons. They would stress that this was not a punishment, only a routine follow-up. And yet, the message would be clear. We are watching you. We decide when a problem begins and when it ends. You may think you have won, but the fight is never over. The plane touched down with a jolt, wheels screeching against the runway. And for a brief moment, there was nothing but the hum of the engines winding down. But then, like clockwork, the passengers came alive again, unbuckling their belts, stretching their limbs, reaching for their belongings. The silver-haired woman across the aisle caught his gaze and gave him a small nod. A simple thing, but heavy with meaning, an acknowledgement, a recognition of history repeating itself in yet another form. The man in the navy blue blazer stood, gathering his bag, shaking his head like he had just witnessed a minor inconvenience rather than something insidious. I hope you don't make too big of a deal out of this, he muttered, as if offering unsolicited advice was his civic duty. Elijah turned his head, met the man's gaze with something calm, something knowing. The deal was already made. He said simply, I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't happen. The man scoffed, but he had no retort. He stepped into the aisle, eager to leave the moment behind. Elijah did not move. He waited. He let the other passengers file out. Let their polite avoidance tell its own story. Some snuck glances at him. Some pretended he wasn't there. The young man who had insisted it wasn't about race kept his eyes down, scrolling through his phone, unwilling to engage with the reality playing out in front of him. And then, finally, it was his turn. Elijah stood, towering as he always did, his movements slow and deliberate. He adjusted his suit, straightened his gold cross, and stepped forward, each footfall a reminder that he was still here, still occupying space, still refusing to shrink. As he entered the jet bridge, the flight attendant from earlier was waiting, standing stiffly beside the supervisor. Behind them, a uniformed officer, not law enforcement, but airline security. Mr. Carter, the supervisor said, his tone clipped, carefully controlled. If you don't mind, we'd like to have a quick word before you leave the airport. Elijah studied him, the well-practiced expression, the rehearsed authority, the underlying message that had been passed down through generations. He exhaled slowly, then smiled, not with amusement, but with certainty. Oh, I don't mind, he said, voice steady as ever, but I think you already know. I'm not the one who should be explaining himself. And with that, he stepped forward, unafraid, unbroken, carrying with him the weight of history and the unshakable truth of a man who had long since stopped asking for permission.